The man sitting under the studio lights wasn't just another talking head invited to fill airtime. He wasn't guessing, speculating, or chasing headlines. This was someone who had spent decades studying the darkest corners of human behavior, someone who had built a career not on opinions, but on patterns. For 30 years, he had worked inside one of the most elite divisions in American law enforcement, analyzing criminals most people couldn't even imagine. Serial offenders, bombers, calculated predators, minds that didn't think like normal people. And now, for weeks, he had been quietly studying one case. A case that, on the surface, looked simple. An elderly woman disappears in the middle of the night. No forced entry. No clear motive. No solid suspect. Just silence. But to someone trained like him, silence was never empty. Silence always meant something. For nearly a month, he had appeared across different platforms, breaking the case down piece by piece. Not rushing to conclusions. Not chasing attention. Instead, he built something far more dangerous than a quick theory. He built a framework, a way of thinking, a structure designed to filter out noise and expose truth. And once that framework was complete, it didn't point outward into the unknown like most investigations do. It pointed inward, toward something much closer. At first, everything about the case pushed people toward the obvious explanations. Money was the easiest one. It always is. When someone disappears, especially someone connected to a well-known public figure, ransom feels like the natural answer. The story writes itself: kidnappers, demands, negotiations, a race against time. And for a moment, it looked like that might be the direction. Messages appeared. Demands were made. Numbers were thrown around. But something didn't sit right. Because real kidnappers who want money don't stay quiet. They don't disappear after making noise. They push. They prove they have the victim. They create urgency because urgency creates payment. But here, there was nothing. No proof. No follow-up. No escalation. Just empty threats floating in the air. To the average person, that might still feel like part of the process. But to someone who has studied real cases, it's a red flag. A big one. Because fake ransom attempts don't come from professionals. They come from opportunists. People watching the news, seeing a moment, and trying to insert themselves into it. And once you remove money from the equation, the entire case shifts. The second theory didn't last much longer. Organized crime. It sounded believable. The location made it possible. The idea of a coordinated group targeting someone connected to wealth or influence, it had just enough logic to keep people talking. But again, behavior didn't match. Real operations like that are fast, precise, efficient. They don't waste time inside a house. They don't fumble. They don't hesitate. And they definitely don't leave behind behavior that looks inexperienced. What the footage suggested was something very different. Someone slower, less confident, someone who looked like they were following a plan, but not one they had executed before. That matters, because professionals don't improvise like amateurs, and amateurs don't operate like professionals. With those two possibilities stripped away, the case became something else entirely. Something more personal. Because what remained wasn't about profit or organized systems. It was about motive driven by emotion. And emotion is where things get complicated. Because now, the reason isn't obvious. It's hidden. It lives inside someone's head. Maybe it's real. Maybe it's imagined. But either way, it's powerful enough to drive action. One possibility is simple in theory, but messy in reality. A grudge. Someone who believes they were wronged. Not necessarily by the victim directly, but by someone connected to her. Families carry networks, friends, colleagues, past relationships, business dealings. All it takes is one negative interaction to plant a seed. And sometimes, that seed grows quietly for years. No one notices. No one expects it. Until something happens. Another possibility is even more unsettling. A grievance that doesn't exist in reality at all. A story built entirely inside someone's mind. To them, it feels real. Completely justified. But to everyone else, it never happened. This kind of thinking doesn't follow logic. It follows obsession. And obsession doesn't need facts to survive. It feeds on perception, on interpretation, on belief. Then there's fixation, the kind that starts harmlessly. A person sees someone on television, feels connected, starts paying attention. Then slowly, that attention turns into something deeper, something unhealthy. They begin to imagine a relationship that isn't real. And when reality doesn't match that imagination, frustration builds. Sometimes that frustration turns outward, toward the person, or toward someone close to them. Because in their mind, everything is connected. Everything means something. And then there's planning. Careful, quiet, patient planning. The kind that doesn't happen overnight. It starts with curiosity. A search here. A detail there. Small pieces collected over time. Individually, they mean nothing. Together, they form a map. A routine. A pattern. And once someone understands a pattern, they can predict it. Once they can predict it, they can act on it. And that leads to the most important idea in the entire case. Information. Not just any information. Specific information. The kind you don't find randomly. The kind that comes from proximity. From access. From being close enough to observe. The more the case was examined, the clearer one thing became: this wasn't random. Random crimes leave chaos behind. They leave broken patterns, unpredictable mistakes, sudden bursts of violence that make investigators chase dozens of different directions at once. But this case was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that only appears when someone knows exactly what they're doing, or at least believes they do. Every small detail from the night of the disappearance began to matter more and more. Investigators reviewed timelines again and again, looking for the moment when something unusual might have happened. The smallest gap in routine could become the most important clue. Neighbors were questioned. Security footage was analyzed. Phone records were studied down to the minute. At first, nothing seemed out of place. But experienced investigators know that absence can be just as important as presence. Something missing can tell a story just as clearly as something visible. The house itself showed no signs of forced entry. No broken locks, no shattered windows, no evidence of a struggle. That detail alone changed the direction of the entire investigation. Because when someone enters a home without breaking anything, there are only a few possibilities. Either they were allowed inside, or they knew how to get in. That idea forced detectives to ask a different kind of question. Who had access? Not just physically, but practically. Who knew the routines of the house? Who understood when people were asleep, when lights turned off, when the neighborhood became quiet? These questions slowly narrowed the possibilities. Family members were naturally the first group examined. Not because they were automatically guilty, but because proximity always matters in cases like this. The closer someone is to the victim, the more information they naturally have. But early interviews didn't reveal anything suspicious. At least, not immediately. Friends were next. Longtime acquaintances, neighbors, business contacts, anyone who might have had a reason to visit the house or understand its daily rhythm. Most of them cooperated fully. Many were shocked, even frightened by the situation. They answered questions carefully, sometimes repeating the same details over and over as detectives tried to find inconsistencies. Yet nothing obvious appeared. Weeks passed, and still the central mystery remained untouched. Then investigators started focusing on something that many people overlook in modern cases: digital behavior. In today's world, people leave behind trails everywhere. Messages, searches, location data, social media interactions, small digital fingerprints that quietly record pieces of everyday life. When analysts began studying those patterns, something strange appeared. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious. But it was unusual. Someone had been watching. Not physically, digitally. Certain public posts connected to the family had been viewed repeatedly by the same anonymous account. Over and over again. Weeks before the disappearance. The account itself didn't say much. No clear identity, no personal information, no photographs. Just a quiet presence that observed more than it interacted. At first glance, it might have meant nothing. Social media is full of silent viewers. But the timing changed everything. Because those views increased significantly in the days leading up to the disappearance. Almost like someone studying a pattern. Trying to understand a routine. Trying to learn when people were home. And when they weren't. Investigators traced the activity as far as they could. The digital trail moved through several layers of privacy protections, making the process slow and complicated. But even complicated trails eventually lead somewhere. When analysts finally reached the last available data point, they found something unexpected. The location wasn't far away. Not another state. Not another country. Just a few miles from the house. Close enough for someone to drive past the neighborhood in minutes. That discovery changed the tone of the investigation immediately. Because now the possibility of an outsider felt less likely. This was someone local. Someone who understood the environment. Someone who had probably seen the house before. Maybe many times. And when investigators looked at the viewing pattern more carefully, another detail emerged. The account didn't just watch the victim's public posts. It watched posts from people around her. Friends. Family. Anyone connected to that social circle. It was like someone quietly building a map of relationships. Understanding who mattered. Who was close. Who visited. Who left. That kind of behavior takes patience. It takes focus. And most importantly, it takes intention. By this point, the investigation had shifted completely. What started as a mysterious disappearance was slowly transforming into something far more calculated. But even with this new information, one major question remained unanswered. If someone had been watching for weeks, maybe months. Why choose that particular night? Why act then? Why not earlier? Why not later? The answer to that question arrived in a way no one expected. During another routine review of neighborhood footage, an analyst noticed something almost invisible. A car. It appeared briefly on a distant street camera nearly 40 minutes before the estimated time of the disappearance. At first, it looked ordinary. Just another vehicle passing through a quiet residential area. But when they compared the footage with other cameras in the neighborhood, the same car appeared again. And again. Moving slowly. Almost cautiously. Waiting. Investigators zoomed into the grainy footage as much as the camera allowed. The license plate was partially visible, but not clear enough to identify immediately. Still, it was enough to start narrowing possibilities. Because even partial numbers can lead somewhere. Vehicle records were checked. Local registrations were compared. And after several long days of cross-referencing data, detectives finally found something interesting. A match. Not a perfect one, but close enough to investigate further. The vehicle belonged to someone who lived nearby. Someone who had no criminal record, no history of violence, no obvious connection to the victim, at least on the surface. But as investigators dug deeper, another small detail emerged. This person had once worked briefly in a place connected to the victim's extended social circle. Not close enough to know her personally, but close enough to recognize her name. Close enough to become curious. And curiosity, when left unchecked, can slowly turn into something else. Something darker. The detectives didn't rush. Cases like this require patience. Acting too quickly can scare someone into hiding evidence or changing behavior. Instead, they started observing. Quietly. Watching patterns. Studying movements. Trying to understand whether the connection was coincidence or something more. Days passed. Then weeks. Nothing dramatic happened. But one thing stood out. The car that appeared in the neighborhood that night was rarely driven during normal hours. Most of its recorded activity happened late at night. Long after most people were asleep. Long after streets became empty. Long after the world stopped watching. And that pattern made investigators uneasy. Because nighttime routines often mean secrecy. And secrecy usually means someone is hiding something. The question was simple. But the answer could change everything. Was this person simply an observer? Or were they the reason the entire investigation existed in the first place? The truth was getting closer. Closer than anyone realized. And when it finally appeared, it wouldn't just explain the disappearance. It would reveal something far more disturbing. Because sometimes the person watching from the shadows isn't just curious. Sometimes they're waiting. At first, it didn't look like a breakthrough. It looked like another small detail in a case full of them. But experienced investigators know that cases don't break open with loud, dramatic moments. They shift quietly, slowly, one small discovery at a time, until everything suddenly connects. The surveillance continued. Days turned into nights, and nights into long hours of watching patterns that didn't quite feel normal. The person connected to the vehicle maintained a routine that was controlled. Too controlled. There were no random outings. No spontaneous movements. Every trip seemed deliberate. Short. Timed. Almost as if they were aware that being unpredictable could attract attention. And yet, one thing betrayed them: repetition. No matter how careful someone is, repetition creates patterns. And patterns can be studied. The car was tracked again. Late-night drives. Similar routes. Passing through the same quiet streets, sometimes slowing down in places where there was no reason to slow down. One of those places was the same neighborhood where the disappearance had occurred. That was no longer a coincidence. Investigators decided it was time to move forward carefully. Not an arrest. Not yet. There wasn't enough direct evidence. But enough suspicion had built to justify a deeper look. A warrant was requested. Approved. And then came the moment that often changes everything in cases like this. The search. When officers entered the property, nothing looked out of place at first glance. The space was clean. Organized. Almost unnaturally so. No visible signs of panic. No obvious evidence lying around. But that, in itself, was unsettling. Because real life isn't perfect. And when someone's environment looks too controlled, it often means something has been carefully hidden. The initial sweep didn't reveal anything significant. No direct connection to the victim. No clear signs of forced involvement. But then, in a storage area that didn't seem important, something unusual was found. A collection. Not of objects with clear value, but of fragments. Printed photos. Screenshots. Notes. Pieces of information that, on their own, meant nothing. But together, they formed a pattern. And that pattern pointed in one direction. The victim. Her routines. Her social circle. Her movements. Even small details that most people wouldn't notice had been documented. It wasn't random curiosity. It was focused attention. Long-term attention. The kind that grows quietly over time. The kind that turns observation into obsession. Investigators continued searching. And then they found something that shifted the entire case from suspicion to something much darker. A hidden digital storage device. Carefully concealed. Protected. And when it was finally accessed, the truth began to unfold. There were recordings. Not just online activity, but real-world observations. Clips taken from a distance. Moments captured without awareness. The victim walking. Leaving her house. Returning home. Living her life. Unaware that someone was watching closely. Too closely. The timeline of those recordings stretched back further than anyone expected. Weeks. Months. This wasn't a sudden decision. It was planned. Built slowly. Carefully. Patiently.